Imagine a late-night phone call that suddenly shatters the calm, bringing dreadful news that every parent fears. Natalie and John Shirilla received the news that their daughter, McKenzie Shirilla, was involved in a horrific car accident. Initially, they only knew that she had been airlifted to the nearest hospital and could be in critical condition. Their hearts pounded with anxiety, hoping desperately that their daughter would be safe. However, what Natalie and John were about to hear was not just about a car accident. It was a far darker truth, one that would forever change the lives of the entire Shirilla family.
Ferguson Alameda, car into a building. 2 are deceased in the vehicle. Daughter's driving.
Just a few short minutes, a horrifying reality unfolded, turning McKenzie from a victim of a car crash into the prime suspect of a double murder, shrouded in hidden secrets. McKenzie Shirilla, a seemingly ordinary young woman and the beloved daughter of Natalie and John, was once the pride of her family, an innocent girl like many others. But one fateful night changed everything. A devastating car crash not only claimed the lives of 2 young men, her boyfriend Dom Russo and their friend Davon, but also thrust McKenzie into the center of a gripping investigation. What truly happened that night? And why did McKenzie, the sole survivor, become the perpetrator in a brutal double homicide? In the early morning of July 31st, 2022, a devastating car crash occurred on the quiet streets of Strongsville. A vehicle sped uncontrollably, lost its course, and crashed directly into a brick building. The impact pierced the silent night, creating a chaotic and wrecked scene. Inside the car were 3 young people: McKenzie Shirilla, her boyfriend Dom Russo, and another friend named Davon. The crash was so severe that both Dom and Davon died instantly. McKenzie was the only one who survived, but was gravely injured and had to be airlifted to the nearest hospital. Initially, the crash was considered a tragic accident, a heartbreaking incident that claimed the lives of 2 young men. However, as the police began to investigate the scene, suspicions began to arise. McKenzie wasn't just a victim in this case. She could be the key figure behind the tragedy. Suspicious clues started to surface. Why was she the sole survivor? And could it be possible that she was responsible for the deaths of Dom and Davon? As the investigative team collected more evidence from the scene, they discovered unusual traces, tire marks, items inside the car, and the presence of illegal substances. A pressing question emerged. Was this merely an unfortunate accident? Or was it a premeditated act of murder? These doubts transformed McKenzie from a crash survivor into the prime suspect of a mysterious double homicide, leaving everyone to question the true story behind that fateful. The night of July 31st, 2022, seemed like an ordinary summer evening for McKenzie Shirilla and her friends. They gathered at a local house party, a typical hangout for young adults looking to unwind. As the night progressed, the mood shifted from casual fun to something more intense. McKenzie, Dom Russo, and Davon decided to let loose, indulging in recreational drugs and alcohol, something that wasn't uncommon for their group. The party was a place of laughter, loud music, and high spirits, but it would also set the stage for the tragic events to come. Around 1 a.m., McKenzie approached the host of the party with a strange proposition, offering to take a hit of acid together, something she had never shown interest in before. The host declined, and soon after, McKenzie, Dom, and Davon decided to leave the party. They drove to another friend's house, where they spent the rest of the night simply relaxing and watching TV, catching episodes of South Park. It all seemed like a typical, carefree night for a group of young college friends. However, as the clock approached 5 a.m., the 3 decided to head back home. While preparing to leave, Davon asked if he could get a ride back to his place. This is where things began to take an odd turn. McKenzie firmly insisted they were in a rush and refused to drive Davon home, despite it being a relatively short detour. The tension hung in the air as Dom stepped in, calming McKenzie and telling her to let Davon hop in the back seat. Reluctantly, she agreed, and all 3 climbed into the car, unaware that this ride would lead to tragedy. What began as a normal night of fun and friendship would soon spiral into a deadly journey, one that would leave 2 young men dead and McKenzie at the center of a dark and disturbing mystery. The drive back home seemed normal at first. Dom and Davon, exhausted from the night's events, dozed off in their seats. But suddenly, McKenzie made an unexpected turn. Instead of taking the usual route to drop Davon off, she veered onto a different path, one that was completely out of the way. At first, it might have seemed like a simple mistake, but what happened next would leave no doubt that something was seriously wrong. Without warning, McKenzie floored the gas pedal. The car rocketed forward, reaching speeds of over 90 mph. Street cameras captured the vehicle flying down the road in the dead of night, headlights blurring into a streak of light. In just moments, the car sped out of the camera's view, heading straight toward a large brick building. Then came the devastating crash. The car collided with the building at full speed, its impact echoing through the empty streets. Real-time footage of police and paramedics arriving at the scene paints a chaotic and grim picture. The vehicle was mangled beyond recognition, debris strewn across the road, and the force of the collision left the car crumpled against the brick wall. Officers rushed to assess the situation, calling for more emergency services. Their flashlights flickered over the scene, revealing the lifeless bodies of Dom and Davon, both killed instantly on impact. Meanwhile, McKenzie was found alive, barely conscious but still breathing, her body pinned and bloodied amidst the wreckage. Paramedics fought to stabilize her and get her out of the car, while officers quickly worked to gather evidence, document the scene, and piece together what had happened. The crash, initially thought to be a tragic accident, soon revealed far more questions than answers. Why had McKenzie taken that route? What caused her to speed so recklessly? And most importantly, what was her true role in the deaths of Dom and Davon? As the sole survivor, McKenzie's life would be spared, but the investigation into what truly transpired that night was only just beginning. As police officers arrived at the scene of the crash, the severity of the situation became immediately apparent. The vehicle was shattered almost beyond recognition, its front end crushed against the brick wall, and glass scattered like confetti across the pavement. Officers moved swiftly, navigating the wreckage to assess the victims. They identified McKenzie as the driver, and Dom Russo and Davon as the passengers, both pronounced dead at the scene. The sounds of sirens and frantic voices filled the air as paramedics worked to free McKenzie from the twisted metal. While emergency responders attempted to stabilize McKenzie, police officers began a meticulous sweep of the crash site. Flashlights shone through the broken windows, revealing not just signs of the violent collision, but also potential evidence. In the back seat, they discovered several bags of marijuana, drug paraphernalia, and other suspicious substances. This immediately heightened suspicion, as it suggested the possibility of impaired driving or illicit activity leading up to the crash. The police then interviewed the person who had discovered the accident, a passerby who had stumbled upon the wreck while driving early that morning. Shaken by what they had seen, the eyewitness recounted the scene to officers. "I was just coming back from breakfast," they said, pointing towards the destroyed car. "When I turned the corner, I saw the wreck. I didn't want to get too close, but I knew something was terribly wrong. I called 911 right away. It was just awful." Their account, combined with the growing pile of evidence at the scene, provided a crucial timeline of how and when the crash had occurred. The eyewitness described the crash site as eerily silent when they arrived, the car embedded into the building, and no signs of movement inside. As investigators continued to piece together the events that led to this tragedy, they collected everything they could find: phones, wakes, and other items inside the vehicle, carefully cataloging the evidence to understand what had happened. However, the presence of drugs and the fact that McKenzie was the sole survivor only deepened the mystery and the looming question: was this a tragic accident, or was there something far more sinister behind the wheel? In the wake of the crash, officers faced the difficult task of informing the families of what had occurred. The first call was to McKenzie's parents, Natalie and John Shirilla, who were unaware of the full extent of the tragedy that had unfolded. When they arrived at the hospital, expecting to find their daughter in critical condition, an officer met them to reveal the grim reality. The officer spoke gently, but his words cut like a knife. "Your daughter was involved in a severe car accident," he said, pausing to let the news sink in. "She's in the hospital, but there's more. 2 others were in the car with her. Dom and Davon, and neither of them survived. Natalie and John were struck with disbelief and devastation. Their minds raced as they tried to comprehend how their daughter had gone from being a victim of a crash to someone who had been involved in a deadly incident that took 2 lives. Tears streamed down their faces, and the room seemed to close in on them. The officer continued to explain that McKenzie was the only survivor and that police were still investigating what happened. The shock of the accident, combined with the weight of knowing McKenzie was now a suspect, left them reeling. Natalie clung to John, both in tears, asking over and over, "How could this happen? How could she survive and not them?" Confusion and despair washed over them as they struggled to understand what led to this nightmare. Meanwhile, the task of informing Dom's family lay ahead, a moment no one was prepared for. Dom's father was at home when officers arrived. He greeted them, unaware of the tragedy that had just occurred. The officers invited him to sit down, and then, in the most delicate way possible, they broke the news. "Sir, there's been a terrible accident," they began. "Your son, Dom, was involved, and we're so sorry to tell you this, but he didn't make it." Dom's father froze, the words hanging in the air, as if they couldn't possibly be real. "What do you mean? How? What happened?" he asked, his voice cracking with disbelief. The officers explained the details as gently as they could, telling him about the crash, the time it occurred, and that Dom had been with McKenzie and Davon. But nothing could soften the blow. Dom's father's face fell into his hands, his body trembling with shock and grief. In just a few short minutes, he went from living a normal day to facing an unimaginable loss. The officers stayed with Dom's father, offering any support they could. But all that remained was a deep silence, broken only by the sounds of sobs and the haunting realization of the tragic event that had taken 2 young lives and left their families shattered. As investigators dug deeper into the events surrounding the crash, they began to question whether this was truly a tragic accident or something far more intentional. The turning point came when they started to notice a series of unsettling details that suggested McKenzie's actions that night were deliberate. One of the most glaring signs was that McKenzie had worn her seatbelt, while both Dom and Davon had not, raising the suspicion that she might have known the crash was coming and took steps to protect herself. This small but critical detail planted the seed of doubt in the investigators' minds about whether McKenzie's intent was to cause harm. Then came another piece of the puzzle. Davon's phone was connected to a safety app called Life 360, which allows users to track each other's movements and speed in real time. When the detectives analyzed the data from the night of the crash, they discovered a troubling sequence of events. The app revealed that just before the crash, the car had accelerated to a dangerous speed, well over 90 miles per hour, and continued to drive at that velocity for a significant period before hitting the building. The data showed a lack of any attempts to slow down or brake, indicating that the speed increase was not accidental but purposeful. This was no momentary lapse in judgment. It was a sustained period of reckless driving. Further confirming these suspicions was the analysis of the car's black box, the onboard computer that records driving information, including speed, braking, and acceleration. The black box data revealed that moments before the collision, the gas pedal was pressed down to its fullest extent. McKenzie's car did not swerve or brake to avoid the impact. Instead, it was driven directly and deliberately into the building at top speed. The absence of any signs of deceleration or loss of control raised the question, why would McKenzie floor the gas pedal and drive straight into a wall? These findings pointed to something more than just reckless driving. They suggested a deliberate act. The mounting evidence turned McKenzie from a survivor of a tragic crash into the prime suspect in a potential double murder investigation, leaving detectives and families alike grappling with the chilling possibility that this crash was no accident at all, but a deadly and intentional act. As detectives delved further into the case, they sought to understand more about McKenzie's character and relationships by speaking to her close circle of friends, as well as those who knew Dom. The testimonies from these interviews painted a complex and at times troubling portrait of McKenzie. Friends of both McKenzie and Dom described McKenzie as someone who regularly engaged in drug use, far beyond the occasional party substance. Many recounted instances of McKenzie experimenting with various drugs, such as marijuana, psychedelics, and alcohol. One friend revealed that McKenzie had a history of using substances heavily at parties, sometimes becoming erratic or overly emotional when under the influence. This raised questions about whether her state of mind on the night of the crash could have been significantly impaired, or if there were other factors influencing her behavior. Beyond her drug use, McKenzie's relationship with Dom seemed tumultuous. Friends described it as on again, off again, filled with heated arguments and emotional turbulence. Some recounted that McKenzie would often struggle to accept their breakups, becoming intensely possessive and sometimes unpredictable when Dom tried to distance himself from her. It painted a picture of a relationship that had many underlying tensions, raising questions about what might have been happening between them in the lead-up to the crash. But perhaps the most surprising revelations came from friends who described McKenzie's fascination with witchcraft and the occult. Several friends mentioned that she practiced various forms of magical rituals, which included the use of pendulums, small weights hung on chains, or strings that she believed could provide spiritual guidance and answers to her questions. Some even claimed she talked openly about using spells to influence people around her or to predict future events. This interest in witchcraft was not seen as a simple hobby, but rather as something she genuinely believed in and actively practiced. One friend recounted that McKenzie kept a doll in her room that she claimed was cursed, and used pendulum swings to make decisions or communicate with otherworldly spirits. She would sometimes mention that she believed she could use these practices to control situations or seek revenge against people who wronged her. Whether or not these practices had any real influence on her behavior, they added another layer to the mystery surrounding her actions that night. These interviews painted McKenzie not just as a troubled teen with a tumultuous relationship and substance abuse issues, but as someone who was deeply enmeshed in the world of dark spirituality, perhaps believing in powers beyond herself. The combination of her volatile behavior, troubled relationship with Dom, and alleged belief in witchcraft cast a shadow over the events of that fateful night, leaving detectives to question how these influences might have played a role in the crash and the deaths that followed. With growing suspicions and mounting evidence, detectives became relentless in their pursuit of the truth behind the crash. They spent days combing through every detail, revisiting the crash site, reviewing footage from street cameras, analyzing black box data, and poring over the Life 360 app's timeline. The more they dug, the more it seemed that McKenzie's crash was far from accidental. Detectives meticulously traced McKenzie's movements and mental state leading up to that night, focusing on her behavior at the party, her escalating speed, and the deliberate path she took before the crash. They interviewed witnesses, scoured McKenzie's phone for messages, and found that the crash was not a spur-of-the-moment decision. It was a series of carefully calculated actions. They pieced together the timeline. McKenzie, high on drugs, makes an unusual offer of acid to a friend at the party, behaves erratically, and becomes insistent on driving at dangerous speeds. The chilling evidence showed that her route was not random. She had circled the area of the crash multiple times in the days leading up to it, suggesting premeditation. Her consistent wearing of a seatbelt, while both Dom and Davon did not, further pointed to a deliberate plan to protect herself while risking the lives of her passengers. Then came the day detectives decided it was time to confront McKenzie directly. They had compiled enough evidence to warrant an arrest, and the charge would be severe: aggravated murder. Officers arrived at McKenzie's home unannounced, their presence setting off a wave of panic. As they approached the front door, McKenzie's mother, Natalie, answered, her face instantly paling as she saw the officer standing on her doorstep. "Is McKenzie here?" one officer asked firmly. Natalie, confused and scared, called for her daughter, who appeared moments later. With calm but unyielding voices, the officers informed McKenzie that she was under arrest for 2 counts of aggravated murder. The room fell silent as the weight of the words settled in. McKenzie's eyes widened in disbelief, her hands shaking as they cuffed her wrists. She glanced at her parents, whose faces were contorted with a mixture of shock, fear, and pleading, desperate to understand how this could be happening. John Shirilla, McKenzie's father, erupted in anger, demanding answers, while Natalie broke down, tears streaming down her face. "There must be some mistake," she cried. But the officers were unmoved, proceeding with the arrest as McKenzie stood motionless, her face a blank mask as they escorted her to the waiting police car. The scene was chaotic, McKenzie's parents following, trying to stop the arrest, shouting pleas for mercy. But the detectives' resolve was clear. They believed they had enough evidence to prove that McKenzie was not a victim of a tragic crash, but the perpetrator of a deadly crime. And with McKenzie in custody, their goal was now to get the full story and uncover every last piece of the truth behind that deadly night. As the police car pulled away, Natalie and John stood on the doorstep, watching helplessly, their world shattered. The young woman they thought they knew was now at the center of a murder investigation that would soon shake their entire community. The trial of McKenzie Shirilla captivated the community, with each day revealing new details about the crash that left two young men dead. The courtroom was packed. Family members, friends, and the media all gathered to hear the unfolding case. As McKenzie sat at the defense table, the once cheerful teenager appeared emotionless, her face pale, her eyes fixed on the floor. The prosecution wasted no time presenting their case. They laid out the sequence of events on the night of the crash: McKenzie's drug use, the sudden acceleration to 90 mph, and the deliberate route she took toward the brick building. They presented chilling evidence: surveillance footage showing McKenzie's car speeding down the deserted road, Life 360 app data detailing the reckless journey, and the black box recording, which confirmed that the gas pedal had been pressed to its maximum just moments before impact. The most haunting piece of evidence came in the form of a video, body cam footage from the officers who first responded to the crash. The video showed the wrecked car, the devastation of Dom and Davon's lifeless bodies, and the eerie calmness of McKenzie as she was pulled from the vehicle, barely conscious yet somehow alive. The courtroom sat in tense silence, the grim images and sounds resonating throughout the room. Gasps and tears came from the families of Dom and Davon as they relived the horror of that night. The prosecution argued that McKenzie had deliberately driven into the building with the intent to harm her passengers. They called on friends of McKenzie and Dom to testify about McKenzie's erratic behavior, her interest in witchcraft, and her turbulent relationship with Dom. Each testimony added a new layer of suspicion, painting a picture of a young woman with a dark and unpredictable side. The defense, however, argued that the crash was nothing more than a tragic accident, the result of a reckless decision made under the influence of drugs and alcohol. They attempted to humanize McKenzie, describing her as a troubled teen who never intended to hurt anyone, someone who was struggling with emotional issues and simply made a grave mistake. But the evidence against her was overwhelming, and it was hard to argue with the digital trail that pointed to a premeditated act. After weeks of intense courtroom battles, the time came for the jury to deliberate. As the courtroom waited with bated breath, the jury returned with their decision. The judge announced the verdict. "We, the jury, find the defendant, McKenzie Shirilla, guilty on all charges." The room erupted into a mixture of gasps, sobs, and stunned silence. McKenzie's parents were visibly devastated, her mother collapsing into tears, while her father held his head in his hands. Friends exchanged looks of disbelief, unable to comprehend how the girl they once knew could be found guilty of such heinous crimes. Dom and Davon's families, though saddened, felt a moment of vindication, a small sense of justice for the loss of their loved ones. McKenzie was convicted on multiple charges: 4 counts of murder, 4 counts of felonious assault, 2 counts of aggravated vehicular homicide, 1 count of drug possession, and 1 count of possessing criminal tools. Her sentencing was severe: 15 years to life, a punishment fitting the gravity of her actions. The judge's gavel hit the desk, sealing her fate, as McKenzie sat expressionless, knowing that her future was now behind bars. With the trial coming to a close, the shock of McKenzie's conviction reverberated throughout the community. The verdict left friends questioning who McKenzie really was, and families mourning lives that were lost far too soon. The truth behind that fateful night had finally come to light, and McKenzie's life would never be the same. She would serve her sentence in the Ohio Reformatory for Women, with her first opportunity for parole coming no sooner than October 2037. McKenzie Shirilla was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison for the deaths of Russo and Davon. As the judge handed down the sentence, the courtroom was filled with a heavy silence. The impact of her actions was painfully clear. 2 young lives lost, families shattered, and a community left grappling with the unimaginable truth. For the victims' families, no amount of justice could bring back their sons. The parents of Dom and Davon clung to one another, tears in their eyes, as the realization of the finality of the situation set in. McKenzie's own family was left broken, stunned by how their daughter, once full of promise, was now facing a future behind bars. The girl they thought they knew, a young woman they loved and raised, was now convicted of one of the most serious crimes imaginable. The emotional fallout was devastating for all involved. The aftermath of the case reverberated throughout the community. The tragic loss of Dom and Davon weighed heavily on their friends and family, who would remember them not just as victims of a horrific crash, but as kind, vibrant young men who had their futures stolen. Their memories lived on in the stories shared by their loved ones, and in the pain that reminded everyone of the fragility of life. This case served as a stark reminder of the consequences of reckless behavior, the impact of impaired decision-making, and the devastation that can come from a single moment of recklessness. It raised deeper questions about the importance of mental health, substance abuse awareness, and the responsibility we all share when behind the wheel. As the dust settled and the community came to terms with the tragedy, there was a call to remember the victims and to learn from the horrific events that led to their deaths. The story of McKenzie Shirilla, Dom Russo, and Davon is not just one of crime and punishment. It's a cautionary tale about the devastating impact of one person's decisions on many lives. As McKenzie serves her sentence, the memory of Dom and Davon will remain as a constant reminder of the lives that were lost, the dangers of reckless behavior, and the lasting impact of a single tragic night. May their memories be a reminder to cherish life, drive responsibly, and think deeply about the choices we make. And let us honor those lost by remembering them not as victims, but as individuals who lived and loved deeply, leaving a lasting mark on everyone who knew them. If you found this deep dive into a chilling true crime story compelling, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Stay tuned for more gripping investigations into the darkest corners of real-life mysteries, where we bring you closer to the untold stories of murder, betrayal, and intrigue. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next episode.